Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first thank Temple Beth Tikva and for inviting me to do this wonderful. I have this wonderful afternoon to spend some time with you, and also the Wayne Public Library for having me also. My subject and my topic is I Have a Dream Too. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King gave his eternal 14-minute speech, and I have lifted out two specific segments of it. One of it speaks to the fact I have a dream that my four little children will be looked at, that's the wrong word, will be looked at and judged, that's the word, will be judged by their character and not by their color. The second phrase that I have lifted out, and why that phrase means so much to me is because I have four children. And of course, as my children are all grown and adults now, but as I grew up, that phrase started meaning more and more to me because I wanted them to have the best that they could possibly have. We tried to provide for them so that that opportunity would be available for them. The second phrase I lifted out was America has given the Negro a bad check. And what he's talking about, he says in that phrase that America has given the Negro a bad check, what he's talking about is reparations. And in order to understand Juneteenth and what he's talking about, I got to take you back a couple of years. 1619, the first the first Africans came to this country as slaves. And from 1619, that's where slavery grew in North America. And actually, that's not altogether true because it really starts in 1526 in St. Augustine's, Florida. But in order to understand that properly, Florida at that time was under Spanish rule. So 1619 is under English rule. That's why it becomes an English-speaking country, is because of 1619 in Jamestown. Now, what's important, slavery didn't even have to start. It really didn't have to continue at 1619. And of course, the following year was 1620, and when the Pilgrims came, and they brought slaves also. And in I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, so follow the dates because that will help you connect the dots. 1820, Daniel Webster was invited to give the 200th anniversary speech at Plymouth. And he reprimanded the founding fathers of Plymouth by saying they didn't have to have slavery. It's a very lengthy thing. As a matter of fact, he talked 2 hours, so I don't want to get involved with that because it's a very lengthy speech. But he did reprimand the founding fathers in Plymouth for bringing and establishing slavery in that part of the English colonies and those part of the English colonies. But the perpetuation of slavery really begins again, or I shouldn't say again, really takes root in 1702, when Queen Anne, who was predominantly the ruler over the colonies, she suggested, and I'm going to specifically talking about New Jersey, she specifically said that she would endorse slavery for the growth of the colony. That's 1702. Now, we wouldn't see, slavery has always been a problem in North Jersey, although they don't talk about it. We mostly hear it about the South. In fact, Bergen County had the largest community of slaves in New Jersey, Bergen County. Matter of fact, in from 1804 to 1840, there's a book that's in the library, it could be up here, called the Black Book, and it talks about all the births of slaves in Bergen County specifically. Now, my friends, that's in 1702 in Bergen County. Now, we'll bring it forward a little faster. 1804 is the first emancipation, and it's a gradual emancipation. And again, I'm leading up to Juneteenth. It's a gradual emancipation, and the gradual emancipation means that it starts July 4th, 1804. Any slave who has a child born after July 4th, 1804, they work and live in servitude until men to the age of 25, women to the age of 21. So around 1832 to 1835, you see the occupation of Patterson's first free African-American community. Patterson was a little different. Now, in between 1804 and 1846, you did have you did have slaves being manumitted before the emancipation or during the emancipation. And a lot of it has to do with religious convictions. In fact, the First Presbyterian Church in Patterson, Dr. Samuel Fisher, who was the pastor there, owned 4 slaves. He didn't release them right away, but he did gradually let them all go before 1846. Why 1846? Because 1846 is New Jersey's emancipation. Now, I got to explain that in its entirety. There are 3 emancipations. 1804, which is the gradual, 1846, which is a state emancipation, and 1863, which is a national emancipation, which is the one that we all look at and we all celebrate as the major emancipation. Again, if I may go back for a moment, the 1804 emancipation, it only exists in 2 places in the world. First and foremost, and I heard this come to me recently. I never heard of that. We've heard about some of the others, but I never heard of that. It's because it is only the gradual emancipation, 1804, is only in New Jersey and in Brazil. Those are the only 2 places in the world. Now, why the 1804 emancipation is so very important also is because New Jersey is the last state in the Union out of the 13 colonies. It's the last state in the Union to abolish slavery. And it has often been said, well, why? Now, and specifically, when we look at Patterson, and that's where I'm from, when we look at Patterson, Patterson being the first industrial city in the country, not just the state of New Jersey, in the country, where they were, 1825, Patterson was known as the cotton capital of the world. Passaic was the woolen capital of the world. And of course, after 1836, Patterson was known as the silk city of the world. Now, you had 7 locomotive companies in Patterson. You had the Morris Canal in Patterson. And I gotta say, why the Morris Canal is important, not just because of travel, but of course that is where the first influx of Irish comes to Patterson. And it comes as a result is they would not let African Americans work on the Morris Canal. The Irish refused to work with them. So what they did is they posted handbills and flyers or posters in Ireland, in Dublin, and all those, I can't think of another name, but in Ireland and all over the country, saying come to the United States, come to New Jersey, get 3 square meals and a good pay. And of course, the influx of the Irish comes to Patterson. Now there were another group of people that worked on the Morris Canal, and they were the Ramapo Indians, and some of them, and I hate to refer to them this way, but this is a term that is factual, that they don't. Well, I shouldn't say they. It's not a good term, but you've heard of the Jackson Whites. The Jackson Whites are a group of a community of a number of nationalities who came together that formed the Ramapo Indians. It was the Iroquois, as well as the Hackensack, the African American runaways, and not just runaways, but free African American or free Africans or free black people, and the Hessian soldiers, deserters. That is the combination of people who formed the Jackson Whites. Now, 1862, Abraham Lincoln was talking about the emancipation, but he didn't know how to initiate it, and he really needed something to help him as a jumping off point to really initiate the emancipation. So after the war, after the battle at Appomattox, in which a number of African Americans, not just African American, no, that's not true. A number of men from Patterson were killed, including Captain Hugh Irish, who's a well-known, if you look at history, he's a well-known person in the history of the Civil War from Patterson, Captain Hugh Irish. Captain Hugh Irish was killed in Antietam on August 17th, 1862. September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which is basically the precursor to the 1863 emancipation. And of course, January 1st, 1863 is when the emancipation really comes into effect. 1865, the next big incidents that really happened in this country as it relates to people of color is 1865. First, you have, because African American, the newly formed citizens in this country, because of 1863, they all followed Abraham Lincoln. In the earliest days of the Republican Party, African Americans or black folks were Republicans, and they all followed Abraham Lincoln. Before his assassination, as part of Reconstruction, Abraham Lincoln issued General Order Number 15. General Order Number 15 is General Order Number 15 is the general order or the executive order that gives the newly freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. After his assassination, President Andrew Johnson, who takes Abraham Lincoln's place as the new president, after the assassination, Andrew Johnson comes into play, and what he does is he rescinds General Order Number 15. That's what Martin Luther King was talking about when he says America has given the Negro a bad check. That's exactly what he's talking about, and that is really the first attempt at reparations. That's where it starts. So after General Order, after the land was rescinded, and the Africans, the newly freed slaves had to give their land back. I won't say give it back. It was taken from them. The country, of course, the country still was moving forward, but there still were a lot of problems with Reconstruction, and that's when the Freedmen's Bureau comes into play. And you have a lot of people, a lot of churches, and a lot of churches who supported the Freedmen's Bureau. In fact, the First Baptist Church in Patterson, founded in 1824, is the first integrated church in the city of Patterson. It was really founded as a particular Baptist church, 1824, and then the congregation got so big that they moved to Ellison in Washington, and the church burned down in 1902 at the 1902 fire. But why that church is important as it relates to the Juneteenth, as it relates to the Underground Railroad, is because a number of the members of their church were very important to the Underground Railroad as well as the city of Patterson. John Jackson Brown, the first mayor of the city of Patterson, who takes office in 1854, was an Underground Railroad agent. He's also credited with a number of other instrumental things that gets Patterson moving. Henry Lowe was a cotton mill owner. He's also not only a cotton mill industrialist who gets his education about slavery from Georgia when he went to visit, and he saw the treatment that the black people were confronted with as black people, as human beings. He comes back to Patterson, and he chose not to be involved with slavery from that point from the rest of his life. He's also the founder of Patterson's first Republican Party. Before the Republican Party got started, they all followed Henry Clay under the Free Soil movement, which is basically another form of Reconstruction in a kind of way, in a way. Anyway, so then you have Henry Lowe, you have John Jackson Brown, and of course you most certainly have Josiah Huntoon. Josiah Huntoon was born in 1813 in Montpelier, Vermont. He moves to Patterson in 1841, the same year that the city of Patterson hosts the first Anti-Slavery Society convention. The Anti-Slavery Society was founded by William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And by 1850, there were 1,200 chapters of the Anti-Slavery Society in this country. Most of them, all of them, for the most part, were on the East Coast, from New England, the New England states, all the way to Georgia. So, with the Republican Party getting started, and with the Anti-Slavery Society getting started, Josiah Huntoon comes here, and he is another person who that is very familiar with slavery. He's from Montpelier, Vermont, but he grows up with a young boy named Ebo. Ebo ran away. He was a slave, but he was owned by his grandfather. He runs away. And of course, that mostly because they grew up together, that affected Josiah Huntoon. Josiah Huntoon became one of the most effective Underground Railroad agents and conductors on the Underground Railroad in the city of Paterson. And I won't say ever, but he most certainly is why we have the monument in the city of Paterson. During this time, from 1841 to 1848, he builds his home, where, if you're familiar with Passaic County College, and that is the best reference I can give you, he builds his home right across the street from Passaic County Community College. And in his basement was basically a storage area. And not only was it his home, but it was also his coffee and spice trade. He made, I won't say manufactured, he distributed or sold coffee and spices. Now, the thing about Josiah Huntoon is he became so versed in the African culture that it's said that he knew more about the continent of Africa than anybody in the area. Now, does anybody know where coffee actually originates? Coffee actually originates in Ethiopia. And of course, it travels to other places, but it actually originates in Ethiopia, which is a continent, or which is a section of Africa. Now, and of course, being in the coffee and spice trades, all of his goods were coming from Europe, either Europe or from the Asian countries or Africa, all those various places. So he becomes a very astute person, as not only in this coffee and spice business, but also in the African culture. 1850, a young man named William Van Rensselaer. He's born in Spring Valley, New York, and he's born free. Now, why he leaves home and he comes to Paterson? Why? And I'm trying to figure this out. 1850 is the beginning of the Fugitive Slave Act. Why he would leave Spring Valley and come south, I never can figure it out, other than the fact that Paterson was an industrial city that maybe had other things to offer him. Paterson was booming. I mean, it really was. 1850 were 50,000 people in Paterson. In addition to all the other industries, you had 1,200 textile mills all supporting the textile industry, not just manufacturing, but you had to have machinists and all kind of other people that supported the textile industry. In fact, speaking of that again, they would not let African Americans work in the textile industry. I only know of one that actually opened a business, but that didn't happen until the 20th century. Okay, here we go. So with all those gentlemen from First Baptist Church involved with the Underground Railroad, and Josiah Huntoon and William Van Rensselaer becoming friends, he lets William Van Rensselaer live with him in his home, and he actually runs his coffee and spice business from his basement. They become such good friends that he sends him to Canada, where he's educated. Now, if you read any books about Paterson and this particular gentleman, it refers to him as an engineer. And I think that's a misnomer, because if he's on the Underground Railroad, you most certainly think that he was an engineer on the Underground Railroad. That's not altogether true. He goes to Canada and he learns his trade, and he comes back as a engineer, but he's a mechanical engineer. Those who know about being a fireman for buildings, boilers, somebody had to roast those spices and herbs and coffee, and grind them. And Josiah Huntoon was so well known because he was one of the first industrialists to actually use steam powered for his grinding purposes. Now, I believe that his going to Canada, he learns the roots He learns all the routes and the contacts for this area of the Underground Railroad, and that's how the Underground Railroad in Patterson gets started. One little diversion, but it's still about the Underground Railroad. Young man named Harry Jackson. Harry Jackson was a slave on a plantation. That's not true, because there were only farms in North Jersey. North Jersey didn't have any big plantations. They had big farms, but not plantations. That's a southern thing. Now, he works on the farm for a gentleman named Cornelius Hopper. Cornelius Hopper comes up from a long line of Hoppers, and where they originated is from Hoppertown. I don't know if you ever heard of that. Hoppertown is today, we know it as Hohokus. And if you do your research with that, you will find that, my gosh, there must have been grasshoppers, not just, there was just so many hoppers in the Bergen County and as well as the Passaic County area. In fact, John Hopper, who was the attorney, he's part of that family, who was the attorney for the Passaic County freeholders. Speaking of freeholders, Josiah Huntoon was a commissioner, now we call him commissioner, was a freeholder for Passaic County. What makes Josiah Huntoon so interesting again is because not only was he a freeholder and a coffee industrialist, he was also a surveyor. So you see, when you put the things together, you see how he knew the land, he knew who to talk to in order to move the enslaved people out of this area. First Baptists were so involved with the Underground Railroad and what they believed in terms of free people, that they were most certainly involved with the Freedmen's Bureau. And they always, and I've seen the books, so it's not like this is hearsay. I've actually seen the church records and to see who they sent the money to in this country. And a lot of it was to Georgia. It was all over the country, but they most certainly supported the Freedmen's Bureau. As things move along, in 1859, let me back up. In 1832, you have the establishment of the first African-American church along an area of Patterson called the African Shore. The African Shore is a very, it's so funny that most people have not heard of it, until recently, maybe about the past 6 years, when I started really talking about it. It is the first place where the occupation of Patterson's first free African-Americans lived and occupied that space. What makes that space, and it's along the banks of the River Street, along the Passaic River. In the 1850s, it had to be a horrible place to live. In fact, the West Broadway Street Bridge, the land was so bad that the West Broadway Street Bridge fell into the Passaic River twice. So you can imagine how the area might have been. It was basically a swamp. There was a young gentleman named, and this I saw it. It's really funny too when I mentioned his name, Richard Lewis Bender. And I was at the temple, and I saw some benders on your what do you call it? Yeah, on the wall, memorial wall. And when I saw that name Bender, his name came right to me, which means he most likely may have been of the Jewish faith. And he did a report in 1920 about the African-American community, and he talked about what that area was like. And that area was like, they lived in the newly freed slaves, 1850. The newly freed slaves lived in tin houses, no windows, no outhouses, of course, no outhouses. And again, it's basically a swamp it was horrible. That was the best way to say it. Now, where they were getting the tin from was a gentleman named Horatio Moses. Horatio Moses is credited being as Patterson's first tinsmith. He most certainly, and again, he's also on the Underground Railroad, and he gives tin to these newly freed slaves. And again, to remind you or to alert you, there weren't a lot of slaves in Patterson to start with. That's number one. There weren't a lot. I mean, even in up until the 1940s, there were only about 1,200 black families in the entire city of Patterson. So my point is, it wasn't until after the Great Migration that you see the influx of Patterson's African-American community growing. So back to the African shore. The African shore is very important because 12 not only was the occupation of Patterson's first free black community, but it is also the founding area of Patterson of 12 African American churches that still exist today. The oldest being the Godwin Street AME Zion Church, which has been renamed the First AME Zion Church. That church, again, it still exists today, and it's also an Underground Railroad safe house. Now, why I'm bringing that to your attention is because that is one of three reasons why in 1859 Frederick Douglass may have come to Patterson. I spoke to you about 1841. You have the Anti-Slavery Society Convention being held in Patterson. Well, the AME Zion Church was there, founded in 1832. And Frederick Douglass was a member of that particular, not congregation, but that particular denomination. 1859, Frederick Douglass is running from the slave catchers who thought he was in Harper's Ferry with John Brown. He's running away, and he's in Hoboken. They thought he was in New York, but he was in Hoboken. He was in Hoboken with his friend, lifelong friend, and some say it was his girlfriend, although he was married. His wife and four children, and he in Rochester, New York. But he spent a lot of time with Ottilio Assing. She's of German descent, and she was to some degree well-to-do, and she sponsored a lot of his trips and a lot of his books. They decided to come to Patterson, and they come to Patterson because the Erie Railroad line, which starts in Jersey City, goes through Hoboken, comes right through Patterson. From Patterson, he stops in Suffern. He gets off in Suffern, and gets off in Suffern, catches another train to Rochester, New York. Now, why? That's one reason why, is because of the train connection. Second reason is because you have the Anti-Slavery Society. We have a chapter here in Patterson. That's another reason. And the members, the 22 members of the Anti-Slavery Society in Patterson were all wealthy men. They were wealthy men, industrialist business people who supported the Underground Railroad and most certainly were against slavery. And please don't confuse the Anti-Slavery Society with the Underground Railroad. Two different things. Although they meant well, and well, I shouldn't say meant well, although they both had the same idea of fighting slavery, the Anti-Slavery Society was administered. They dealt with the laws. They dealt with trying to eliminate slavery by the laws. The Underground Railroad was a mechanism to move people in and out and move them forward. So that is the difference. So that's the first reason is the anti-slavery, is the train, the transportation. Second reason is the Anti-Slavery Society. And the third reason is Frederick Douglass was a member of the AME Zion denomination. So he has friends here. He had friends here that he probably didn't even know. So he comes to Patterson under cover of night, and he moves on to Patterson. 1865, Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated. Also, with his assassination comes General Order Number 15, which was rescinded. Also, you have the end of the Civil War. And I got to tell you, there are 18 African Americans from Patterson who fought in the Civil War. And I used to spend a lot of time at Eastside Park because there's a monument there with a list of all the men who fought in the Civil War from Patterson. And of course, I took my long lens and I took pictures of that and studied it, and their names weren't on there. And I couldn't figure out why. I said, here we go again. They don't even want to see us. Their names are not listed because they came back home. The people who are listed in Patterson at the memorial in Eastside Park, and it wasn't always there. It used to be by the Great Falls. They were some of the 211 men from Patterson who were killed, along with the 2,000 some who enlisted, and the 600 and some who came back injured. So you have a lot of people, young men from Patterson who fought in the Civil War, and again, 18 of which were African Americans. I can tell you what their occupations were, where they lived, and there's one, I will tell you another time, but one guy, he's really got a very interesting story because I was able to trace him back. Anyway, getting back to the Underground Railroad and getting back to what's happened in 1848 when Harry Jackson escapes. Again, he's with Cornelius Hopper, and he escapes in 1848, and he escapes by one of two roads. Now, I believe that one of the roads that he may have went might have been Goffle Road. The reason why Goffle Road is because Goffle Road goes right into Hopperstown, today's Hohokus, goes right to it. And the other way he might have went, he could have went up Cannonball Road. Anybody ever heard of Cannonball Road? No, but there's another one. But it starts in Patterson. Hayden Avenue Hayden Avenue in Patterson is Cannonball Road. So he may have went to Cannonball Road going up to Pompton, and he gets to, I believe that he may have gone through the Ramapo Mountains. Either way, he's still going through the Ramapo Mountains, and he may have ended up at Sloatsburg in an area in order to get there, he had to go up Nigger Road and to a free black community that lived on Nigger Pond. Just off to the left of them was Nigger River. Now, why that's important is because Nigger River is the Ramapo. There are 5 rivers that actually feed the Passaic River, which were all escape routes. You have the Pompton, I won't start naming, but anyway, you have the 5 rivers, and the Ramapo was one of them. So from that point, he goes on to work as a stevedore on the Hudson, where he meets a gentleman named Elijah Finkel. Elijah Finkel is from Columbia County, New York, and he just takes a liking to this guy. He's a good, hard-working young man, and he asks him would he want to work for him on his farm. And he agrees, and he says yes. They leave and they go. Harry Jackson leaves and goes with Elijah Finkel. And I was speaking to Art, and I asked him, is Finkel a Jewish name, or how can he said, well, not necessarily, but I've been trying to run that down and find out whether Elijah Finkel was Jewish. And I have my anyway. Anyway, the 1860 census. Again, this is before the emancipation. The 1860 census, Elijah Finkel actually changes Harry Jackson's name to Harry Finkel. And in the census, it reads Harry Finkel. After the emancipation, he goes back to his original name, Harry Jackson. After the death of Elijah Finkel, his daughter marries a gentleman, and they move from the farm in Columbia County, and they move to Bristol, Connecticut. Yeah. They moved to Bristol, Connecticut. And Harry Jackson, he goes with him, and he spends the rest of his life there, and he dies at the age of 104 in the year 1904, which is really remarkable because when he died, he even had money which had to go to probate because he had no family. Yeah, I think he died with about $500. And of course, in the turn of the 20th century, I shouldn't say I guess, $500 was a lot of money. That's a lot of money today. I mean, so that's and why that's important as far as Patterson and the Underground Railroad and freedom is because that is the only slave or only person that I have been able to trace from the day he ran away, or the year he ran away, to the day he died. So that's 1848 back to 1865. So you have the ending of the Civil War. Got to tell you a good story about that. 1865, at Appomattox, when Lee surrenders to General Grant, there was a young surgeon that was there, and it's a long story about how he gets to work with with General Grant at Appomattox. So what happens is after Lee signs his surrender, General Grant tells one of his officers to go out there and tell them to stop fighting. The war is actually over. It's unfortunate that the officer that he told was his horse went lame. So he tells this young man to go and tell them to stop fighting. The war is over. His name is Elijah Marsh. Elijah Marsh, and why it's important again to Patterson, is Elijah Marsh is from First Baptist Church in Patterson. He is actually credited, although they don't talk about it this way, he's actually credited with ending the Civil War, even though because he's the one who delivered the message that the war is over. He's from Paterson, New Jersey. One other thing about 1865, young man named Joseph Crowell, First Baptist Church. Joseph Crowell joined the Union Army with a number of other young men. And on April 12, 1862, he was in Washington, D.C., and starting his tour of duty. And his job was to watch over, guard the unfinished Capitol building. And he sees this guy standing over there in the shadows, and the guy's just standing there, not knowing who he was. Finally, the guy turns around and he walks over to him, and lo and behold, who do you think it is? Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln asked him, the president asked him, what's your name? He says, Joseph Crowell. He says, where are you from? I'm from Paterson, New Jersey. And he says, these are my friends. And he says, I'll get to them. The president says, I'll get to them. Anyway, from that point on till his assassination, Joseph Crowell and Abraham Lincoln were somewhat friends. They talked to each other on occasion. And as a credit to their friendship, after the assassination, Joseph Crowell from Paterson, New Jersey, actually stood guard at the foot of Abraham Lincoln's casket. That's Paterson, New Jersey. 1865, Juneteenth, after Appomattox, Juneteenth. How that comes about, here we took a long time to get there, but it took 400 years. But anyhow, how it happens is 1863 emancipation was signed and goes into effect, and it takes almost 2.5 years for that message and that news to reach Galveston, Texas. General Order Number 3 was issued to General Gordon Granger, and his job was to go and spread that news to free all the slaves, and that all the 250,000 slaves in Galveston, Texas. He frees those slaves, and that's where the holiday, or the African American Independence Day, comes from. And I've got to say this, it's not just in the Americas. Juneteenth really spans the Caribbean nations, and there are 15, it's called the CARICOM nations. There are 15 nations in the Caribbean that are part of Juneteenth, which is we don't often talk about, but we're not the only ones. And I think there's some in Europe also, but I know about the CARICOM nations for sure. So that is where Juneteenth comes from. And that's how it gets started. And today we are continuing to celebrate Juneteenth as our National Independence Day. Now, do I have a few more minutes? All right, here we go. Even in 1863, 1865, after Juneteenth, the 13th Amendment was ratified in December of 1865. 14th Amendment was ratified in 1866. And the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Why the 15th Amendment? They're all important, but they don't have the bite that the 15th Amendment does, because it gives us the right, gives African Americans now the right to vote. The first African American in this country was Thomas Peter Mundy. He's from Perth Amboy, New Jersey. The first black man to vote in this country is Thomas Peter Mundy from Perth Amboy. And ever since then, we have been fighting for voting rights. And again, throughout this country and throughout the life of this country and African Americans, voting rights has always been a problem. And I won't say a problem, yeah, it's always been in the purview of everybody. And most certainly for the people who have not been able to vote, Freedom has the independence. Juneteenth represents independence, and for independence and freedom. Freedom has always been an issue in this country, and it's not just about African Americans. I love what Bill Pascrell said at the temple about 2 weeks ago. He said they first came for the Indians, then they came for the Irish, then they came for the Jews, then they came for the blacks, then they came. He says, and guess what? They're coming for you. And of course, when you look at history and you look at what's going on today, you can see that our freedoms are being challenged from every possible way. Your human rights. I don't have to name them, but there are probably about a dozen of our freedoms that are being challenged. 1896, you have the first Civil Rights Act was passed. why that's important as it relates to civil rights in Patterson. Minerva Miller, she wanted to, her and her friends wanted to go to the movies. At that time, they called them the Nickelodeons because it only cost a nickel to go. So she goes to the theater to see a movie. White folks only had to pay 5 cents. She had to pay, they wanted her to pay 25 cents, and she had to sit in the balcony, which she refused, which she refused to do. And because of that, she sued them. And Robert F. Buckley, and I keep saying, I wonder he's related to William Buckley. But anyway, Robert F. Buckley decided to take her case. And she wins the case. She wins $500 based on a nickel. And she wins the case, and it is the first civil rights case that really speaks to the fact that you are free to go wherever you want. And I forgot the law that, it has to do with the 14th Amendment. Can't think of what I want to say exactly, how I want to say it, but it's the 14th Amendment, meaning, stating the fact that you have the right to go anywhere you want as an American. So, around the same time all this is happening, Minerva Miller, why she probably gets this gusto to fight is her father is the pastor of the Godwin Street AME Zion Church. So she's got this fight, and she's got it honest. You know, she's around the people who most certainly challenge the law and most certainly challenge other people, challenge the law. That's a better way to say it. So, and of course, for those who may not have heard of Ida B. Wells, Ida B. Wells is someone who most certainly, as an African-American woman, really was a journalist, but she was an active civil rights leader, and most certainly a leader as a suffragette. She's also one of the founders of the NAACP. Ida B. Wells was most certainly very influential when African Americans be part of the 19th Amendment, and most certainly part of the 15th Amendment. Why that's important? It's said, and I can't think of her name now, but she's from Tenafly. What's her name? But she is Carrie. It's not Carrie Nation. Stanton. Thank you. Miss Stanton was didn't want to come. She didn't want to unite the black women with the white women because she felt that the white women should have gotten the vote first. And when Thomas Mundy Peterson got the vote first, when black folks, she went nuts. So behind that, the women's movement or the suffrage is split to the national suffrage movement and the I forgot the name of it, but the other one was operated by Lucy Stone. Lucy Stone actually goes to she's educated in Ohio, and can't think of the name right now, too many things, in Ohio, and she comes back to New Jersey where she lives in Montclair. Lucy Stone must have been something because she actually wouldn't pay her taxes because how could she felt that if she couldn't vote and be represented properly, then I'm not paying my taxes, and she didn't. They ended up taking her home for taxes, of all things. They took her home for taxes. But it goes to show you what kind of woman she was. I'm not paying taxes on property that I can't, if I'm not represented. So of course in 1920, you have the 19th Amendment being passed, and with the women having the right to vote. And with that being said, there's a lot of, from that point on, even up to today, the voting rights is most certainly a problematic thing for a lot of people. And of course, we've all been trying to figure out why. And of course, we all speculate why. And the only people who really know are the people who do what they do to stop people from voting. And most certainly African Americans or African American people. And before I forget, I want to say this. We talked about Martin Luther King and reparations. Today we're fighting for reparations again. Now, not recently, with this year, this year in the state of California, there was a family that was given their land, not their land, but I think they were given their money and I think possibly the land as part of reparations. And the bill that is under is H.R. 40. H.R. 40, you're going to start hearing a lot about that because it seems like everybody's getting stirred up. My wife and I kind of disagree, not about H.R. 40, but about what should happen in terms of if there's money involved. There's a couple of states that are really, here's another good one with Tulsa. There was money given back to African Americans in Tulsa because of the Tulsa riots in the early 20th century. And so again, my wife and I disagree about what they should get. And I happen to believe that I think that African Americans as part of reparations should be given money, or it should go to black institutions by which you can get an education. I personally don't see trying to write checks for everybody, because everybody is a descendant of slaves at some, even my family. I mean, I know where they came from. So I won't say everybody, but there are a lot of people who are descendants of slaves. So trying to straighten that, I think, for your future and for your children and grandchildren, I think the money should go to an institution, an African-American institution of higher learning. That's my opinion. My wife feels like she wants the money. So during the turn of the century, we have the Great Migration. And I believe that the Great Migration really comes under three parts. The first one being after the 1862 Morrill land grant, where black people were given land again. Now, I won't say black people were given land, the colleges were given land to build the land grant colleges. And I forgot how many they are, but there are quite a few land grant colleges in this country, and not all African American. Some of them are Native American. There are a lot of land grant colleges, and I believe that's where the money is. So now you see the first migration of some of those early graduates from those land grant colleges coming north. Everybody couldn't stay where they were. They had to come north to apply their trade. And that's where you see a lot of Patterson's first African American doctors. And I can name four that who signed the application for the NAACP for their charter in 1919. Now, that's the first, for me, that is the first migration. Second migration happens in around 1911, when this country is involved in World War I. And with all the soldiers all the men going into war, there was a labor shortage. And there were men who would go south and bring African Americans north to work in the mills, the factories, and wherever. And that was called the push-pull factor. The push factor was because of segregation, they were actually being pushed out anyway, because being pushed out. The pull factor is because they felt that there were jobs, there was money, there was jobs, and of course they weren't living under the kind of oppression that they lived in the South. So that's when, during that time when they were coming here, one of the reasons why that push-pull factor was so effective is because Congress initiated an act saying that they could not or would not allow immigrants to come to this country, because they didn't know who might have been working for other nations, and they felt that it was they didn't want to do a lot of immigration especially from Europe, and most certainly from Europe. Now, that's the first, and that's the beginning of the second migration. The third migration really begins in World War II, when in 1941, President Eisenhower signs the General Order, executive, now it's changed now from general to executive order, I think it's 9981, which is the executive order that if you have a company that is involved with the military, if you made goods for the military, I can't think of the word I want to say, but if you made goods for the military, if you didn't employ African Americans and other nationalities, most certainly African Americans, you could not keep those government contracts. That's what Franklin Roosevelt. That's where that executive order, and that's what happens with that. The second big thing that happened, and again, because of that, you see African Americans working at General Electric. You see them at Wright's Aeronautical, Wonder Bread, all the major all the major industries in Patterson that were under the government contracts, military contracts. That's one of the pull factors that brought a lot of African Americans to Patterson. In fact, I do believe General Electric, and again, I've done some research, but sometimes some things are hard to find. But from my preliminary research, I believe that General Electric made transmissions, electric transmissions, and I believe that transformers and transmissions, but they or parts for the transmission, and I believe that some of those parts may have been in PT 109 because of what they did. And again, my research points heavily to that statement, which I can most certainly give you the information to back that up. So that's the first major thing that happens. The second major thing happens in 1948 when Dwight Eisenhower, and I think that's Executive Order 8891 or 90. Yeah, the numbers are so 8891. And that is the executive order that desegregates the military. And it's really funny about the military in this country, even from 1775 to even George Washington during the Revolutionary War, didn't want slaves fighting in the military. And the reasoning was he thought that they would start a fifth column. A fifth column is when you have the loyalists on one side, and you have the Continental Army on the other side, and they felt that if you gave slaves weapons, there would be something right in the middle, and you don't know who they'd be fighting for. So it was called the fifth column. And I know that for those history buffs, that's a Civil War term, but it most certainly refers to the Revolutionary War. So in 1948, General Eisenhower issues Executive Order 8891, which desegregates the military. That's another thing that brings African Americans to Patterson. And all of these things are part of, to me, they're extensions of Juneteenth. There's another thing that I gotta say about freedom. That's the four freedoms. January 6, 1941, as part of as part of Roosevelt's State of the Union speech, he talks about the four freedoms. And I really don't think, and one of the four freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of want, and freedom of fear. And I don't think that he was looking at the African American community at large when he gave that State of the Union message, because we lived through that all the time. I mean, we lived through that all our lives. You might have been able to go to church and do whatever you do in church, but for the most part, freedom of speech was most certainly not like today, but it was most certainly something that was, how can I say, tamped down a little bit. You couldn't just say anything. You couldn't just do anything. And when it comes to freedom of want, my gosh, we all wanted a job and a better life. I have a dream that I could have a better life, and that never, for some of us, and even today, that still hasn't happened. And of course, freedom of fear, my gosh, we're all walking around with our eyes, we're walking backwards because we don't know what is coming from behind us. And that's why I'm saying we have grown into a country where our freedoms are being challenged, and the freedoms that Roosevelt was talking about are being challenged. We look at the 1965 Voter Rights Act, that's being challenged. In just about everything you can think of when it comes to freedom and the freedoms in this country, and especially for African Americans. And of course, we have a new group of people, and I won't say new, we have more people coming to this country, but all of those things are being challenged today. And I do believe that all of those challenges are basically a spin-off or a continuation of Juneteenth and the freedom that African Americans were given. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a privilege talking to you, and it is my job to encourage you to help me give you my best, and that only happens when you ask me questions.